Hey everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for a 5-minute Bible study through Exodus chapter 8. We're trying to do one chapter a day, and today is Exodus chapter 8. I think it's going to be a Monday when this video is released, so happy Monday. Hope this gets your week started off on a good foot, your work week at least. When did the events of Exodus chapter 8 take place? Well, the when, the who, and the where are going to be pretty similar for this chapter as they were from the last couple chapters, and they will be for the next couple chapters. So, as we've already talked about and mentioned several times, Moses was born about 1591 BC, and he was 80 years old when he stood before Pharaoh as God's representative. Our main characters in this chapter, we've got the Israelites who we've been talking about. They are a large nation of people who have been enslaved by the Egyptians. They are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we've got Moses. He was a Hebrew boy who grew up in the house of Pharaoh, and now God has called him as his representative to go to the Pharaoh of Egypt and to demand that he let the Israelites go and be free. We're also going to talk about Aaron, who is Moses' brother, and finally, Pharaoh. He is the stubborn, rebellious king who does not want to listen to God's commands. Our map is going to look pretty familiar. The events of this chapter happen in Egypt. The Israelites lived in a region of Egypt known as Goshen. And so now into our outline. If you remember in the last chapter, we talked about the first of 10 plagues that God sent on the nation of Egypt. The first plague was the water that was turned to blood. You remember that? 7 days passed since that time, and we're going to talk about the second plague in verses 1 through 15. So Moses and Aaron were told to go to Pharaoh and to once again demand that he let the people go into the wilderness to sacrifice to God. And he was supposed to be told that if he refused, God was going to send a plague of frogs on Egypt. Well, Pharaoh's heart was still hard. He didn't fear God, and evidently he didn't fear a plague of frogs. And so Aaron stretched out his rod over the waters, and the text says that, quote, frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. That would be a lot of fun. However, Pharaoh's magicians were able to convince Pharaoh that they had similar powers using their secret arts. And so Pharaoh's mind wasn't changed, at least for a while. A while later, Pharaoh called Moses back to him and asked him to plead with the Lord to take away the frogs. Pharaoh agreed to let the people go when the frogs were gone. And so the next day, all of the frogs died, and the Egyptians gathered them into piles, and it says that the whole country stank, which I can't even imagine that. Pharaoh, though, hardened his heart again, and he didn't keep his promise to let the Israelites go. So then in verses 16 through 19, God brings a third plague on Egypt, this one the plague of gnats. So God told Aaron to strike the dust of the ground with a staff, and when he did, the dust became gnats, and they filled the entire nation of Egypt. Pharaoh's magicians once again tried to recreate this miracle and to convince Pharaoh that they had this ability. However, they were unsuccessful this time, curiously. And they told Pharaoh, quote, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he wouldn't listen. He wasn't ready to be humble yet. And the text says that gnats covered every man and animal in Egypt. And then we have the fourth plague in verses 20 through 35, and that's the plague of flies. So God, through Moses, once again demanded that Pharaoh let the people go. Pharaoh refused to do that, and so God sent a plague of flies on the Egyptians. God told Pharaoh that as a sign of his sovereignty and of his control over the natural world and over Egypt, God told Pharaoh that the flies were only going to affect the Egyptians. They weren't going to affect the Hebrews, even though they lived in close proximity. So the next day, God sent a massive swarm of flies that covered the Egyptians, their houses, their animals, and the ground on which they walked. And it says that the flies, quote, ruined the land. Pharaoh told Moses once again that if he would plead with God, if God would take away the flies, he would let the people go into the wilderness to sacrifice. And so God took away the flies. But do you think Pharaoh actually let the people go? No, he hardened his heart again, and he didn't keep his promise once again. And so that is chapter 8. We've talked about 4 plagues now: the water turned to blood, the frogs, the gnats, and the flies. I think somewhere between the frogs and the gnats, that would have been the end of me. I would have been ready to bow out. But Pharaoh, if nothing else, was headstrong. So now let's talk about an application. Reading about the plagues makes me appreciate just how finely tuned and balanced our world actually is. Can you imagine what the world would be like if the ecosystem didn't keep the flies and the gnat populations in check? Can you imagine how terrible the world would be and the living conditions if the earth permitted mosquito birth rates to multiply exponentially? The world is habitable because of its creator and the harmony that he has designed into it. So the next time you read your biology textbook or watch a nature documentary online, give thanks to God for the checks and the balances that he has put into our world.